The room had no windows. That was the first thing Margaret noticed when she walked in. No windows, no sky, no outside world. Just four walls the color of old bone, a long polished table that reflected the ceiling lights like a mirror, and a kind of silence that sits on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. She held her handbag against her stomach with both hands. Inside the bag was an envelope. Inside the envelope was the last thing her husband had ever given her. She had not opened it in 3 years. Not once. She had carried it to church, carried it to the market, carried it to the hospital the night her blood pressure spiked and the nurses told her to rest. She had carried it the way some people carry a photograph. Not to look at, but to feel. She was 61 years old. Her shoes were clean, but worn thin at the heel. Her dress was pressed with care. She had done her hair that morning the way Thomas used to like it. Pulled back, simple, neat. She did not know why she had done that. Thomas was gone. But some habits are really just love wearing a different coat. She sat down on one side of the long table. Across from her, on the other side, sat Dominic Hale. He was 34. He wore a suit that cost more than Margaret's rent for 6 months. His watch caught the light every time he moved his wrist, which was often because he moved the world like a man who had never once been told to wait. His hair was perfect. His jaw was sharp. He had the easy, relaxed posture of someone who has never needed to be nervous in a room. He looked at Margaret the way you look at something small and forgettable, a receipt, a used napkin, something you glance at before throwing away. He was already smiling before anything had even begun. Between them, at the head of the table, sat Mr. Osei. He was the lawyer. He was somewhere between 50 and 60, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a dark suit that had no shine to it all. Quiet, serious, like the man himself. He had a thick brown folder in front of him, closed. His hands rested on top of it. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply watched, the way a clock watches, steady, patient, missing nothing. "Thank you both for coming," Mr. Osei said. His voice was low and even. "We are here to complete the final instructions of the late Mr. Thomas Adewale, as prepared by this office and witnessed 3 years ago, 2 weeks before his passing." Dominic shifted in his chair. "Let's move this along. I have a 2 o'clock. Mr. Osei did not look at him. "We will move at the pace the documents require. Mr. Hale." Something passed across Dominic's face. Quick, like a cloud, and then the smile came back. Mr. Osei turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Adewale, your husband left specific instructions for this meeting. He asked that you bring the envelope he gave you. Do you have it?" Margaret nodded. She reached into her handbag slowly, and when she placed the envelope on the table, she did it gently, the way you set down something fragile, something that once held warmth. The envelope was plain and white, but soft now with age, the corners bent from years of being carried. Thomas had written her name on the front in his careful handwriting. Margaret, just that, just her name, in blue ink, like she was a whole address. "May I?" Mr. Osei asked. She nodded again. He picked it up, opened it cleanly, and removed what was inside. It was a check. Small, rectangular, ordinary. The kind of thing you could lose between sofa cushions. $10. Dominic stared at it for 1 second. Then he laughed. It was not a quiet laugh. It came from somewhere deep and unguarded, the kind of laugh that escapes before manners can catch it. He pressed his fist to his mouth, but his shoulders shook and his eyes creased, and when he finally brought himself under control, he looked at Margaret with something worse than cruelty. He looked at her with pity. $10, he said. "The great Thomas Adewale. 40 years of friendship with my father, and this is—" He shook his head, still smiling. "Mom, I'm sorry. I don't mean any disrespect, but $10. Margaret looked at the check. She did not look at Dominic. Her hands were folded in her lap now, perfectly still. Her eyes were dry. She had cried all her tears long before this room, long before this table, long before this moment. She had cried them in kitchens and in cars and in the dark at 3 a.m. when the other side of the bed felt as wide and cold as the ocean. She had no tears left for a man like Dominic Hale. Mr. Osei set the check down on the table, carefully, deliberately, as though it were made of glass. "Mr. Hale," he said. He still did not raise his voice. "Are you finished?" Dominic waved a hand. "I'm just saying, for the widow of a man my father called his closest friend." "Your father called Thomas Adewale more than a friend," Mr. Osei said. He opened the brown folder. "He called him the reason he was alive." The smile on Dominic's face did not disappear all at once. It faded slowly, the way light fades when a cloud moves across the sun, first dimming, then going. Mr. Osei placed both hands flat on the open folder and looked at Dominic directly for the first time. "The $10 check," he said, "is not the inheritance." The room went very still. "It is the first instruction. And now that it has been presented, now that this meeting has been called, and you are both here and you have both seen it, the second instruction becomes active." He reached into the folder and removed a thick set of papers, each one bearing a dark red official seal. He set them on the table between a laughing man who had gone quiet and a quiet woman who had known all along. "Mrs. Adewale," Mr. Osei said, and his voice held something that sounded almost like satisfaction, "your husband was a very careful man." Margaret looked at the papers. For the first time since she had walked into that windowless room, she breathed. The papers made a soft sound when Mr. Osei spread them across the table. Not a dramatic sound, not the crash of thunder or the sharp crack of something breaking. Just a soft, dry whisper, paper against polished wood. The kind of sound that should mean nothing. But in that room, at that moment, it was the loudest thing Margaret had ever heard. Dominic leaned forward. His elbows came to the table. The easy, careless posture was gone now, replaced by something tighter, something that looked like a man trying to read a language he did not know. His eyes moved across the official seals, across the columns of typed words, across numbers that were not small. His jaw moved once, silently. "What is this?" he asked. His voice had changed. It was still controlled, still the voice of a man who had spent his whole life in rooms where he held the power. But underneath it, something had shifted. A small crack, thin as a hair. "But there, this," Mr. Osei said, turning the first page so it faced Dominic cleanly, "is the Kita estate. 42 acres of land in the coastal region, including a main house, 2 smaller buildings, a private road, and direct access to the waterfront. It has been held in a protected legal trust for 11 years. Dominic stared. Under whose name? Under a numbered trust. Controlled by this office. Mr. Osei paused. Pending this meeting. Pending this. Dominic stopped himself. He sat back. He looked at Margaret. She was still folded into herself, quiet, her hands in her lap, watching Mr. Osei with the focused patience of a woman who had been waiting a long time for something and had learned not to rush the last few steps. "Did you know about this?" he asked her. Margaret looked at him for a moment. "Thomas told me there was a second gift," she said. He said, "The first one would tell us who was in the room." Dominic blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mr. Osei said, without looking up from the papers, "that your reaction to the $10 check was part of the process." He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Mr. Adewale was thorough. The crack in Dominic's voice widened just slightly. "So this was a test." "It was a measure," Mr. Osei said. "There is a difference. A test can be passed or failed and forgotten. A measure becomes part of the record." He turned another page. "And the record, Mr. Hale, begins long before today." He removed a single sheet from the back of the folder. It was older than the others, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, the typing faded but legible. He placed it in the center of the table, between the two of them, like a referee placing something down before both players. "August 1987, Mr. Osei said. Your father, Mr. Gerald Hale, was not yet wealthy. He was 26 years old, running a small trading business that had just collapsed. He had debts he could not pay, a partner who had stolen from him, and a court date in 2 weeks for a contract he could not honor." Dominic said nothing, but his eyes were fixed on the old paper. He had one friend at that time, one person who knew the full truth of what had happened. Not the version Gerald told at dinner parties later, but the real version, the embarrassing version, the version where a young man had trusted the wrong people and lost everything and did not know how to survive it. Mr. Osei's voice did not change. It stayed level, unhurried, like a river that knows exactly where it's going. That friend was Thomas Adewale. Margaret closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them, they were soft and far away, like she was listening to music only she could hear. Thomas was not rich either, Mr. Osei continued. He was a civil servant. He earned a modest salary. He had a young wife. He glanced at Margaret briefly. And a small home, and no extra money to speak of, but he had something else. He had a cousin who worked in the courts, and he had the kind of courage that does not calculate the cost before it acts. Dominic's hands, resting on the table, went very still. Thomas spent 3 weeks negotiating on your father's behalf, calling a favor here, writing letters there, sitting in waiting rooms for hours, vouching personally for a man whose name was associated with failure at that moment. He did not do this for money. Gerald had no money to give. He did not do it for influence. Thomas had no interest in influence. He did it because Gerald was his friend, and his friend was drowning, and Thomas Adewale was not the kind of man who watched a friend drown. The old paper on the table showed, in faded type, the record of a settled debt, a court withdrawal, a clean slate. The case was dropped, Mr. Osei said. Gerald Halle rebuilt. Within 5 years, he was profitable. Within 15, he was wealthy. Within 20, he was a man whose name was on buildings. He paused. And Thomas Adewale went back to his modest salary, his small home, and his wife. He never asked Gerald for anything. Dominic's mouth opened, closed. But Gerald did not forget, Mr. Osei said. He spent the next 3 decades trying to figure out how to repay a debt that had no price tag. He could not simply write a check. Thomas would have refused. He could not make a grand gesture. Thomas would have been embarrassed. So instead, he did something quiet. He purchased a Kita estate, placed it in trust, and wrote instructions that it would pass to Margaret Adewale upon Thomas's death, to be activated at a meeting where both she and his son were present. The room was so still that Margaret could hear the faint hum of the building's electricity. Gerald died 14 months before Thomas, Mr. Osei said. He asked me to complete what he had started. He asked me to make sure his son understood not just the transaction, but the reason for it. Dominic was staring at the old paper. His perfect jaw was tight. His expensive watch caught the light. But he did not move his wrist anymore. Your father was not a man who forgot kindness, Mr. Osei said, and now there was something almost gentle in his voice. Whatever else he became, whatever the size of the company, whatever the name on the buildings, he remembered a young man's shame and a friend who covered it. He wanted you to know that. Dominic did not speak for a long time. When he finally looked up, he did not look at Mr. Osei. He looked at Margaret, and she looked back at him, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction of a woman who had been wronged and was now watching the scales tip. She looked at him the way you look at someone standing in the rain who has only just realized they are wet, with patience, with something that was not quite pity and not quite warmth, but lived in the quiet space between the two. He never told me, Dominic said. His voice was smaller now, not weak, smaller, like something that had been carrying more air than it needed and had finally let it out. No, Margaret said softly. Thomas never told me either. Not the full story. He just said your father was a good man who had a hard beginning. She paused. He always spoke well of him. Dominic looked down at his hands. Outside the windowless room, somewhere beyond the walls, the city continued its noise, cars and voices, and the ordinary chaos of people living their lives. But in here, something old and buried had just broken the surface and come up into the light. The paper sat between them, sealed and official and patient. 42 acres, a main house, a private road, a waterfront, and underneath all of it, older than any deed, heavier than any seal, the memory of a young man drowning and a friend who would not look away. Mr. Osei removed his glasses from his forehead, placed them on his nose, and looked at both of them. There's one final page, he said. The final page was not long. That was the first thing Dominic noticed when Mr. Osei slid it across the table. After all the sealed documents, after all the official language, after pages and pages of legal words that felt like walls, This last page was barely half full. Simple sentences, clear and direct. The kind of writing that does not need to impress anyone, because it already knows what it is worth. At the top, in the same careful handwriting that Margaret had seen on the envelope, the same blue ink, the same steady hand, were 2 words. For Margaret. She made a small sound. Not a cry. Something smaller than a cry. The sound a person makes when they've been holding their breath for 3 years, and finally, the air comes back. Mr. Osei did not rush her. He sat with his hands folded and let the room be what it needed to be. Dominic sat very still. The man who had walked in with a 2 o'clock appointment and a careless grin was gone. In his place was someone younger looking. Somehow, as though the arrogance had been a kind of armor, and now that the armor was off, you could see the actual person underneath. He was not a monster. He was just a man who had been handed so much, so easily, for so long, that he had forgotten things could have waited. Mr. Osei began to read the final page aloud. Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I hope you're not too sad, because I've tried my best to leave you something that will hold you, not just money. Money runs out. I want to leave you something that lasts. The estate is yours. Gerald and I agreed on this a long time ago, over a dinner that neither of us talked about afterward, because that was how we were. 2 men who made big decisions quietly and then went home and said nothing. I want you to live there or sell it, or do whatever makes you feel free. That is all I ever wanted for you. Freedom. But I also want to leave you one instruction. Not a legal one. Just a human one. Forgive people quickly. Not because they deserve it, but because you do. The room was perfectly silent. Margaret had both hands pressed flat against the table now, on either side of the final page, as though she needed to hold herself to something solid. Her eyes were wet, but her back was straight. She read the words again, silently, her lips moving just slightly. The way people reread things are too important to only read once. Dominic watched her. Something was happening to his face. It was not a quick thing. It moved slowly, the way ice melts in stages. First his brow loosened, then his shoulders dropped, then his mouth, which had been pressed into a tight, controlled line, went soft at the corners. He was not crying, but he was close to the territory where crying lives, standing at its border, looking in. Mrs. Adewale, he said. His voice was different now. Not smaller exactly, but cleaner, like a room after all the furniture has been moved out. More space, more echo, more honesty in the air. Margaret looked at him. I laughed, he said. He did not dress it up. He did not explain it or justify it or wrap it in a butt. He just said it plainly and let it stand. I laughed at you, at a $10 check, at your husband's name. He stopped, swallowed. I didn't know, but that's not really. He stopped again, shook his head. Not knowing is not the same as being innocent. I came into this room already deciding what you were worth, before you even sat down. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You came into this room the way your father came into the world before Thomas found him, convinced that worth is something you are born with. She said it without sharpness, without performance. She said it the way you say something true, gently, because truth does not need a sharp edge to cut. Your father learned differently. That's why we are here today. Dominic closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he nodded. One single nod, slow and heavy, the kind that carries more weight than words. Mr. Osei turned to the final set of transfer documents, the ones that would make everything official. He uncapped his pen. He turned the pages to the signature lines, smoothed the paper flat, and placed the pen on the table. Mrs. Adewale, he said, whenever you are ready. Margaret picked up the pen. Her hand was steady. She signed her name in the same careful way she did everything, with quiet attention, without rush, as though the act itself mattered, not just the result. When she set the pen down, it made a small final click against the table. It was done. 42 acres, a main house, 2 smaller buildings, a private road, a waterfront where the evening light would fall on water that now, legally and completely, belonged to a woman in worn thin shoes who had carried an envelope for 3 years without once opening it. Dominic stood up. For a moment, he just stood there on his side of the table, and Margaret sat on hers, and Mr. Osei watched from the head of it, and the room held all three of them in its quiet. Then Dominic walked around the table. He did not walk the way he had walked in, that loose, easy stride of a man, performing his own importance. He walked carefully, like someone moving through a space they now understood deserved respect. He stopped beside Margaret's chair and he extended his hand, not the firm, brisk handshake of a business meeting, but open, offered, waiting. Margaret looked at his hand. Then she took it. His grip was gentle. Hers was steady. "My father chose well," Dominic said quietly. "In his friend." Margaret looked up at him. "So did mine," she said. "In his—" They stayed like that for just a moment. A widow and a billionaire son, connected by a handshake over a history neither of them had fully known, bound by a debt that had been paid not in money but in loyalty, in sacrifice, in the stubborn, quiet insistence of two men who believed that a promise made in a hard moment was a most important kind. Then Margaret stood. She picked up the $10 check from the table, that small, worn, ordinary rectangle paper, and she held it against her chest just for a second, the way you hold something that has finished its purpose but still deserves to be honored. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in her bag. She would not throw it away. She knew that already. She would put it in a frame. She would hang it in the main house, in whatever room caught the most morning light. And when people asked her what it meant, she would tell them the truth. "It means someone loved me carefully. It means a promise outlived the man who made it. It means $10 can be the biggest thing in a room, if the room is willing to listen." Mr. Osei held the door open. Margaret walked through it first, back straight, handbag held close, shoes making their soft sound on the floor. Behind her, Dominic paused at the door and looked back at the long table, the scattered papers, the pen still lying where it had been set down. He stood there for a moment, taking it in, the whole room, the whole afternoon, the whole inheritance of it. Then he turned off the light and walked out. Outside, the day had begun its slow turn toward evening. The sky had gone the color of warm copper, and the air had cooled just enough to feel like a kindness. People moved along the street below, carrying their bags and their burdens, their ordinary Tuesdays packed with ordinary things, unaware that somewhere above them, in a windowless room that now stood empty, something had shifted. Not the world. Just three people. Just one afternoon. But sometimes it is how the largest things begin. Not with fanfare, not with headlines, but with a worn envelope placed gently on a polished table and a room quiet enough to finally hear what it has been trying to say. Margaret stepped into the evening air. She breathed. And somewhere, in whatever place the careful, quiet, faithful ones go, Thomas Adewale smiled. If this story moved you, held you, or made you think of someone you love, please share, and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary things, about debts paid in silence, and about the kind of wealth that never shows up in a bank account. Don't miss the next one.